There's not a lot of information from the New Testament writers, in particular, dictating to Christians how they should practice sexual activity. That's good for you, right?
You can't handle the truth.
Welcome to the Next Evolution Podcast.
The whole concept of a sexual relationship in marriage has shifted quite a bit over the years. Some research was done in 2015 and 2016 to talk about several different categories. And over 20 years ago, 40% of the people believed that gay marriage and same-gender loving marriage was not really a cool thing, compared to 60 to 79% believe that now it is. Having babies outside of marriage 20 years ago, 45% approved. Now it's up to 70%, 68 to 70% approved that, hey, there's no cultural taboo about having a baby outside of marriage. More research shows us that sex between unmarried individuals have increased from 58% 20 years ago to 78% today. And then divorce 20 years ago was 59%, sort of expected or not taboo. Now it's up to 73%. And get this one, this is an interesting one. Polygamy 20 years ago was 7% not taboo, like only 7% of the population was open to that conversation compared to over 20% today. So it's important for us to understand that traditional gender roles have changed. People are no longer seeing sex in marriage or sex outside of marriage as a taboo issue. Now, these stats tell you and I that there has been significant shifts and changes in how we view marriage and how we view sexual relationships in the confines of marriage. Young people, Gen Zers and those in the future generations, they're not getting married. As a matter of fact, they're deciding to wait to get married. They're deciding to live together before they get married, or even if they get married at all. So everything is changing, y'all. More and more. What we're learning from these different changes in social context is that people don't feel marriage is necessary to engage in sexual behavior. Look, man, you and I, we got to get on with the times. If we don't get on with the times, then we'll get left behind. We'll become irrelevant, and we won't be able to speak to what's happening in our culture today. So once again, let's lay the groundwork. What people thought was taboo 20 years ago, they no longer think that. So let's keep that in mind. People are more apt to have sex outside of marriage than they were 20 years ago. Let's keep that in mind. Let's remember, gender roles have changed. So women are not just there for a man's sexual pleasure or vice versa. So what does the Bible have to say about sex in marriage? But there's a lot of different conversations, there's a lot of different narratives, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, that talk about this subject of sex and relationship. You got Abraham had multiple wives, Solomon had multiple wives, David had multiple wives, Noah in the book of Genesis had sexual relationship with his own daughter. So I'm not quite sure if the Bible is the best, particularly the Hebrew Bible, for us to understand or get an idea about sexual relationship in marriage. Now, in the Old Testament, there are several other very, very complicated stories that talks about this whole conversation. In the book of Ruth, Ruth actually conspired with Naomi to seduce Boaz to, as the scripture says, uncover his feet, which is actually a euphemism for touching his genitals. Well, that's gonna stir up a lot of crap. Okay, so, that's one very, very graphic example. So please make sure that the kids don't hear this, but we all grown folks up in here. Right? In sex in a marriage relationship in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible is extremely convoluted, extremely complex. A lot of different moving parts that if you don't understand the whole basic narrative, you can get lost in the details. But here's what we do know for sure. We know for sure that there are several texts in the New Testament that talks about man and wife or partner relationships and how sexuality is to be exercised. There's one text in the Bible in particular that many people have argued over what the interpretation of the book is, and that's in the book of Song of Solomon. And you can see that right here for you to see the correct spelling of that. Some authors or some biblical interpreters have said that the Song of Solomon is actually a metaphor for God's relationship with Israel. However, there have been some other theologians who say, no, the Song of Solomon is a graphic depiction of God's relationship with Israel, or some others would say that it is a graphic detailing of sexual relationship between two people. I got a few texts I'm going to read for you. And I'm going to read them, and I'm just be patient. Just hold on right there. Just don't run away right now. Just be patient. But I'm going to read a few of these texts, and I want you to listen very closely as I read these texts. And these, again, are coming from the Song of Solomon. This particular text is from Song of Solomon, chapter 3, verses 1. It says, "On my bed at night after night, I sought him. My soul loves him. I sought him, but did not find him." Here's Song of Solomon, chapter 4, says, "Your breasts are like two fawns, whoa, which feed among the lilies until the day is cooled, when the shadow flees away." Here's another one. Verse 11, "Your lips, my bride, are drips of honey. Honey and milk are under your tongue." Look, this is graphic stuff. Here's one last one and we're done. "I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me. Come, my beloved, let us go into the country. Let us spend the night in the villages." Y'all know where this is going. "Let us rise early and go to the vineyards. Let us see whether the wines or vines are budded. There I will give you my love." So here in the Song of Solomon, there are many other texts that are even more graphic than that. I mean, some even talks about fellatio in this text. These are very, very graphic portrayals of sexual activity between two people. And we don't necessarily know if they were married. And I read that to you so that you can understand, number one, their sexual relationships in marriage are for pleasure. Procreation also is a part of it, but the scripture verse doesn't necessarily say or suggest that sex is only for procreation, but it is something to also be enjoyed. People ought not feel bad about sexual activity within the confines of a committed relationship. And I think that's what's most important as we look forward, because what we see right now in our culture is that, people are deciding not to get married, but they are deciding to engage in sexual activity before they get married, right? And so a good way to handle it is not to crucify people about their practices, but to provide education, to provide good understanding of how a healthy sexual activity in relationship is vitally important. Get that? Vital. So the New Testament actually places sex and marriage as secondary. There's not a lot of information from the New Testament writers, in particular, dictating to Christians how they should practice sexual activity. That's good for you, right? So what you do have in the New Testament is that you hear about, there's several verses in the gospel that talks about eunuchs, particularly in the book of Acts. There's Philip the eunuch that is talked about, right? So these are individuals who decided that their purpose was to be that of following God or following the message of a higher power. And so they literally castrated themselves so as to dedicate themselves totally to their mission and their purpose and their calling. He talked about how a husband and wife should relate to each other in humility, not considering one more powerful or deserving of more rights than the other, but actually being in community with each other, right? So Paul was basically saying in Corinthians that you can't use sex as a weapon. You can't use it to dominate the other person. It's not something that one person can demand from another. No, it is a mutually agreed, consensual experience that both people engage in. That's important because these men out here, you can't be using that scripture verse to say woman ought to submit to me as Christ submitted to the church. That means that she must do everything. No, please, we don't do that. Likewise, when it comes to women, right? The scripture verses in Corinthians talks about how you should not hold sex as a way to manipulate and get what you want out of them. So in both of these instances, we were talking about the scripture verse, and Paul in particular is talking about how we are to use sex correctly, not as a way for manipulation, not as a way to get what you want, not as a way to exert authority, but in humility, considering the needs of the other person above your own. Got it? So here's what we learned. We've learned, one, that sexual activity can happen in marriage and outside of marriage. That the Bible provides very convoluted expressions as well as some clear distinctions. But what we don't see is that marriage, sexual activity should only happen in the context of marriage. Because when we look at the Bible, the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, as well as texts in the New Testament, we see references to couples in relationship, but we also see sexual behavior kind of running all over the place in the Bible. And so I think these are stories that we can look at, but we got to be really careful on how we accept those interpretations as something that's applicable today, because some of it may not be applicable to us today. So that's vitally important, okay? Thank you so much for listening. If you have questions for me, you can send me an email. There's an email right there for you. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more great content that we brought to you today. Peace, chicken grease, and I'm out.